It gives me great pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Sally Gainsbury, Senior Policy Analyst at the Nuffield Trust. Prior to joining Nuffield, Sally was an investigative journalist for the Financial Times and news editor for the HSJ. At Strasys, she's fondly known as the author of Gainsbury's Law. More on that later. To help set the scene, Sally will discuss where does the money go and why there aren't any silver bullets to fix the NHS. So, over to you, Sally.
Thank you so much for having me. Can we have the first slide, please? Hi. So the purpose of my first slide is to underline the point that I'm sure everyone who's joined today is horribly aware of, which is that the money, the resources allocated to the NHS presently, which is the red line, is really shows no fundamental change in the trend. There hasn't been a radical change in funding settlements for the Department of Health with the change of government. It's pretty much followed a very similar trajectory. You obviously see that large bulge over the COVID period, but we're looking at the moment at, after we adjust for the increase in ENIC cost in the NHS over the 2 years since the change of government to the end of this financial year, the Department of Health's resource budget probably increasing round about 2.6% average each year. That compares to 2.4% in the decade leading up to the change in government. So really probably an imperceptible change on the eve of the spending review. I think there's probably not much expectation of any significant rabbits from the Chancellor's hat next week. And the situation this financial year is particularly tough when the the Department of Health is looking at sub 2% real terms increase in its overall funding once you account for that increase in ENIC's cost, which is obviously being baked into the funding levels, but goes in and then comes straight back out again. Two other things just sort of point out, sort of put the funding level into context. The upper dotted line you see in the chart there is what Department of Health funding would be if it had risen in line with the long-term trend between 1979 and 2019-20. So that's a 3.7% figure that the NHS had been used to over the long term. There's now around about a £37 billion gap between where we are today and that long-term trend. And then the dashed line below sort of shows sort of the opposite side of that argument, which is what Department of Health's budget would be had it only increased in line with population and ageing. I think think tanks are probably partly responsible to this. That we often talk about what the NHS budget, we adapt spending figures for population growth and ageing to sort of imply that drives a huge amount of healthcare spend, but actually it drives quite a small increase in healthcare spend, and you can see that you can see funding today would be around about 30 billion lower had it only risen in line with demographic change and population growth. Move to the next slide, please. I'm going to illustrate that a little bit further. So one of the things that I've been asked, probably think on about a fortnightly basis since the new Chancellor's autumn statement last October, is have they really given the NHS 22.6 billion more money? And if so, where's it gone? Because Wes Streeting keeps pointing out the NHS has received this extra money, and yet the NHS is clearly still sort of strapping in for some, is already well strapped into some very difficult decisions and some difficult months ahead. So yes, the NHS or the Department of Health was awarded 22.6 billion extra at the autumn statement. In fact, it's even gone up slightly more since then. So that's the extra cash that the NHS has this financial year compared to the financial year in 23-24, just before the change of government. What we've tried to do here is break down where that money has gone, and this is to help illustrate what are the funding pressures in the NHS. So direct you first of all to the biggest lump of red block in that chart, which are there's two big lumps of red block, which is inflation in 24-25, which ate into over 9 billion of the extra money, and then inflation this year, which includes the pay offers that were announced last month now. So obviously part of the difficulty the NHS faces is it frequently finds itself sort of slightly out of sync with inflation in the whole of the economy, which tends to be the government's preferred measure of inflation, the GDP deflator, because pay awards tend to come a little bit later than pay awards in the private sector. But we can see a huge chunk of the extra money and a huge part of the pressure is actually in inflation that's hitting the NHS last year and now this year. The second largest consumption of NHS resource is actually the second red block along, which is what I call higher demand, which is distinct from population growth and ageing. The first red block you see there is the budget, how much of the budget is consumed simply by population growth and ageing over the 2 years that the 22.6 billion has been allocated to. Much more significant is the increase in demand that is essentially associated with technological advance. So that's the increase in demand over 2 years that is associated with improvements in healthcare technologies, crucially new drugs that come into the market that are approved by NICE and therefore mandated to be funded by the NHS, and that's the sort of this constant moving goalpost that the NHS finds itself. And this is one of the reasons why I underline that technology is certainly not a silver bullet to rescuing the NHS. If anything, technology increases cost in healthcare rather than reducing it. Perhaps we can. I'll just point out towards the end of the waterfall chart, you can see a slight sort of recovery, sort of uptick in the spending pressures, and that's first of all coming from provider recurrent efficiency. So over these 2 years, we might at best expect providers to manage to muster 6 billion, so roughly 3 billion a year of recurrent efficiencies. I would flag that that providers made huge reductions in their temporary staffing costs last financial year, and they're which I think probably does cast doubt on their ability to repeat that all over again, because once you've cut something once, assume you've done so recurrently, you can't obviously then cut it again. Another thing to flag is this is the appearance of the immigration health surcharge, which when introduced in 2015 was always controversial, but a relatively small charge that was levied on temporary migrants to the UK. It is now increased fourfold in the size of the charge, which is levied every year to temporary migrants, and is really now quite a significant contribution to the Department of Health's budget. So it's probably going to be a roughly 1.5 billion this year. And there's also some real sort of uncertainty around the timing of its arrival. It tends not to be baked into budget documents. It kind of arrives later as a transfer for the Home Office. And I think it's kind of one to watch, and it's curious to see the rising significance of this contribution, which many would feel is actually a double taxation on a very small part of the population. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so having ruled out technology as a silver bullet, I also want to rule out another very popular potential silver bullet that has been discussed in Whitehall roundabout since the change of government. I think there's some interest in it before, which is, if in order to sort of stem the growth in NHS expenditure, we need to shift care out of expensive acute hospitals and into community settings. And there's been a lot of interest in setting a community and/or primary care investment target to allow that to happen. The problem with investment targets are sort of the lowest form of performance management that one can get. We'd much prefer to see targets, if we are to have targets, targeting particular outcomes, or if we can't manage outcomes, targeting particular outputs. But it's understandable that in areas such as community and primary care, where outputs and processes can be less tangible, harder to measure than hospital processes, that policymakers might be tempted with an investment target. But this, I'm just presenting here findings from some analysis we've done of the mental health investment target, which of course was introduced from 2018-19, and that was a target for commissioners to increase the spending, what they're spending on mental health faster than everything else. Now, this was a great success in that commissioners duly did increase their spending on mental health between 18-19 and 23-24. I think it slightly declined in the years that followed. But one unintended consequence of that has been an increase in reliance in temporary staffing in the mental health sector. Now, how in this analysis, what we've done is we've looked at, because you can't directly measure the mental health investment standard. It's not a sort of a pot of money that mental health providers get. It's merely something that if you are a mental health provider, you will be exposed to, because commissioners have been told to increase their spending with you faster than anything else. What we show here is this is results of some linear regression analysis, where we've looked at the extent to which, that's my alarm telling me I was speaking too long. We've looked at the extent to which a trust is the amount of income a trust earns that is for mental health services. On the left hand side you have trusts that earn nothing from mental health, and on the right hand side you have trusts where 100% of their income is for mental health. This is with most mental health trusts, well, a lot of mental health services delivered by trusts that deliver a bit of acute, a bit of community, a mixture of things. And basically what I want you to observe is as a trust becomes more mental health, so the more mental health a trust more mental health services a trust delivers, the more the trusts increase the ratio of their spend on agency to permanent staff over the 18-19 to 23-24 period. This is not an association that existed prior to the introduction of the mental health investment standard. If you can see there's a box whiskers charts. This is real world data, so it's quite messy and dirty. So there's we're showing on there the 95th confidence intervals. But you can see there's a clear trend, and in fact around about 20% of the variation in the change in how dependent a trust has been in that period on agency staff, about 20% of that variation is explained by the extent to which the amount of mental health services that they provide. Can we just skip over the next slide, because it's simply showing you the reverse for acute trusts. And this final slide, I'm making a bit of a habit of showing this slide when I give the presentation. Takes a tiny little bit of explanation. This is taken from the NHS England document on the allocation formula, which sets out how resources are allocated across the NHS. It's telling you how much per head each CCG or sub-ICB area gets for a year. Across from left to right, you have CCGs grouped according to the mean age of their population, and top to bottom you have them grouped by deprivation, with the most affluent towards the top and the most deprived towards the bottom. What I want to direct attention to is the missing bottom right-hand corner. There are no CCGs which are in the most deprived decile, and that fall in the most deprived decile and the oldest decile. And, we all know why, but it should be, it's because in poor areas life expectancy is so much lower. It should be an outrage, and I think the real test for the NHS going forward is if any left shift or investment standards or any adoption of new technology we should always be asking the question, what is this change or what is this adoption going to do to address that missing bottom right hand corner? I will leave it there because I'm over time.
Sally, thank you very much. Really, really good insight. And I think what really comes out from that is the difference between perception and reality. And I think your last point in terms of, people flocking towards silver bullets, such as technology and rideshare and all the big policy, is all about how do we actually make a difference to the communities. There are a few questions I've got on my list. Love to kind of come back to those after we've kind of gone through all the speaker conversation.